I never thought I'd tell this to anyone. But then, my daughter sent me one of your videos 3 months ago, and I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, watching a stranger pour her heart out about losing everything she believed in. And for the first time in years, I cried. Really cried. Not the silent tears of grief I'd grown used to, but the kind that shakes your whole body, that comes from somewhere so deep you forgot it existed. I was a teacher of the Quran for 37 years. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was doing Allah's will, that my life was a perfect example of submission and devotion. I wore my faith like armor, protective and unbreakable. I thought I had all the answers. I thought I was safe in my certainty. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March, when my son was 23 years old, studying engineering, prayer-calloused hands, and memorized verses, and a heart that was questioning things I'd taught him never to question. The last time I saw him alive, we had argued about faith, about doubt, about whether a loving God would really send most of humanity to hell. I was wrong about so many things, but I was most wrong about this. When my son left this world, when the machines stopped beeping and the doctors stopped trying, and I held his cooling hand in mine, his last words weren't a confession of faith in Allah. His last words, whispered with more peace than I'd ever seen on his face, were, "Jesus, I see him. I'm going home." My life was built on certainty, constructed brick by brick with verses from the Quran and the approval of everyone who mattered. From the moment I drew my first breath in my grandmother's house in Lahore, I was destined for a life of perfect submission. My mother wrapped me in soft cotton and harder expectations, teaching me that my purpose was predetermined. Serve Allah, serve my family, serve my community, and paradise would be my reward. I learned to read from the Quran before I learned to read anything else. The Arabic flowed from my tongue like honey, sweet and sacred. By the time I was 12, I could recite entire surahs from memory, my voice joining the chorus of other young girls in our small madrasa, our heads covered, our eyes downcast, our hearts supposedly pure. My parents arranged my marriage when I was 17 to Mahmoud, 8 years older, already proven in his devotion to Allah. Our wedding was simple but joyful, and I moved into his family's house with gratitude. This was the life I'd been prepared for, the life every girl in our community was meant to want. Motherhood came quickly. When I held my son for the first time, I whispered the call to prayer in his right ear and named him Ahmad, after one of the names of Muhammad himself. I promised Allah that I would raise this child to be a perfect Muslim, a man who would carry on the faith without question. Teaching came naturally to me. By the time Ahmad was 10, I had my own classroom, my own reputation as one of the most devoted teachers in our district. My days followed a rhythm as predictable as the call to prayer itself. I woke before dawn for Fajr, walked to the madrasa with my hijab perfectly arranged, spent mornings teaching young girls to read the Quran, to understand their place in Allah's plan. Ahmad was such a good boy, so eager to please, so quick to memorize new verses. When he was 12, he won first place in our district's Quran recitation competition, and I wept with pride as he stood on that small stage, his voice clear and strong and faithful. Evenings were for family prayers, for gentle conversation, for the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to divine instruction. We were, by every measure that mattered to our community, a blessed family. We had enough money, a solid reputation, the respect of our neighbors, and most importantly, the certainty that we were living exactly as Allah intended. I remember thinking that I had found the perfect formula for a meaningful life. Faith plus obedience plus service equaled peace. Questions were for those who lacked sufficient trust in Allah's wisdom. I thought strength meant never showing weakness, and wisdom meant never admitting ignorance. But children grow, and with growth comes complexity. The first sign something was changing came when Ahmad was 16. After Jumu'ah prayers, I heard him talking to his father with unusual urgency. "But Baba, what about people who never heard about Islam? What about little children who die before they can choose? Does Allah really send them to hell just for being born in the wrong place?" Mahmud's response was immediate and firm. "These are not questions for us to ask, son. Allah's justice is perfect, even when we cannot understand it." But Ahmad's voice didn't quiet the way it used to. Instead, he pressed on. "But if we're supposed to love Allah, shouldn't we understand why His love seems so conditional? Why does He love us only if we believe the right things?" This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the child who had accepted every teaching with trust and enthusiasm. This was someone I didn't recognize, someone who seemed to be pulling at the very foundations of everything I'd built my life on. When I entered the room, both of them fell silent, but I could see something in Ahmad's eyes I'd never seen before. A hungry searching that made me profoundly uncomfortable. Over the following months, the changes became more obvious. Ahmad still performed his prayers, still attended Friday services, but there was a distance now, a sense that he was going through the motions. I found him once, sitting by his bedroom window during Maghrib prayer time, not praying, but simply staring at the sky. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "I was wondering what it would feel like if God smiled at me instead of watching me with anger." The words sent a chill through me. I realized with growing unease that my entire relationship with Allah was built on fear and obligation. I feared His punishment, I feared His disapproval, but loved. When had I ever felt genuinely, unconditionally loved by the God I'd spent my entire life serving? Ahmad started spending more time online, reading things in English I couldn't understand. When I asked him about it, he said he was exploring different perspectives on faith. I told him that Islam contained all the perspective anyone needed, that looking outside our faith was dangerous. But my words seemed to slide off him like water off stone. I found books in his room that didn't belong there, not just Islamic texts, but books about Christianity, Buddhism, even books by authors who questioned religion altogether. When I confronted him, he said calmly, "Mama, if Islam is really the truth, shouldn't it be strong enough to withstand questioning? Shouldn't it become clearer when compared to other beliefs, not more fragile?" His questions haunted me because I didn't have good answers. I had been taught to accept, not to analyze. When Ahmad asked why Allah had revealed Himself through so many different messengers, if only the final one was correct, why He had allowed centuries of people to follow religions that would damn them, I found myself angry, not just at him, but at the questions themselves, The final conversation came on a winter evening. He had been unusually quiet all day, and when I asked what was troubling him, he said, "Mama, I had a dream last night. I was in a beautiful garden, and there was someone there who radiated love like sunlight. He didn't ask me to prove anything or fear anything. He just loved me completely, without conditions. And when I woke up, I realized I've never felt that way about Allah." I told him that dreams could be misleading, that what he was describing sounded dangerous. But even as I spoke, something in my chest ached because I had to admit that I had never felt unconditionally loved by Allah either. Ahmad nodded when I finished my warnings, but I could see in his eyes that my words had not reached him. He was already somewhere else, moving toward something I couldn't understand. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. "Mrs. Hassan, this is Dr. Malik from University Hospital. Your son Ahmad has been brought in. You need to come immediately." The 20-minute drive passed in a blur of panic and prayer. I recited every verse about healing, promised Allah everything I had if he would just let my son be okay. The emergency room was chaos. Bright lights, urgent voices, constant beeping of machines. A young doctor led me to a room where my son lay connected to tubes and wires, his face pale but peaceful. "He collapsed during his morning lecture," the doctor explained. "There appears to be some kind of neurological event. We're doing everything we can." I pulled a chair close to his bed and took his hand. It was warm but limp, and when I squeezed it, there was no response. Even unconscious, surrounded by medical equipment, he looked more at peace than I'd seen him in months. The tension around his eyes, the weight in his shoulders, seemed to have lifted. I began to pray out loud, letting the Arabic flow over him like a blessing. I recited verses about healing, about Allah's power over all things, about His mercy toward those who call upon Him sincerely. Hours passed. Mahmoud arrived from work, and we took turns holding Ahmad's hands and whispering prayers. Friends from the mosque came, bringing flowers and more prayers. The Imam himself came Wednesday evening, reciting long passages in his deep voice. Everyone was certain that if we just prayed hard enough, believed strongly enough, Allah would answer our prayers. But the machines kept beeping their mechanical rhythm, and Ahmad's breathing grew shallower with each passing hour. The doctors spoke carefully about brain function and prognosis, but I refused to hear them. Allah was testing our faith, I told myself. On Thursday night, as I dozed in the chair beside his bed, I felt something change in the room. Not anything visible, but a shift in atmosphere, like the moment before dawn when darkness gives way to light. I opened my eyes and saw that Ahmad's eyes were open too, looking not at me, but past me, past everything visible, his face filled with wonder. And he whispered, "Mama, there's so much light, and there's someone here with me." He was looking at something I couldn't see, his expression one of absolute joy. "He's been waiting for me," Ahmad said, wonder filling his voice. "All this time, he's been right here." I tried to tell him it was medication, tried to call for the nurse, but he squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Who?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Ahmad turned to look at me directly, his eyes brighter than I'd ever seen them, full of peace that defied everything happening around us. "Jesus," he said simply. Jesus is here, Mama. He says he's been calling me for so long, and now I can finally hear him clearly. The monitors started beeping urgently, but Ahmad seemed oblivious. I'm not afraid anymore. I understand now why I could never feel peace in the prayers. He was never in the rules or the fear. He was always in the love. Footsteps were running down the hallway toward our room, but Ahmad's eyes stayed fixed on something I couldn't see. He smiled then, the most beautiful smile I'd ever witnessed, and said, "Jesus, I see you. I'm ready to come home now." Those were his last words. Jesus. The name I'd been taught to respect, but never to love, never to believe could save anyone. But my son spoke it like it was the most beautiful word he'd ever learned, like it was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. The doctors rushed in, tried to restart his heart, tried to call him back. But I knew it was over. I had seen his face in that final moment, seen the absolute peace that death couldn't touch, seen the joy of someone who had finally found what they were looking for. Whatever Ahmad had seen, whoever had been waiting for him in that light, had given him something I had never been able to give him in all my years of faithful submission. The days after Ahmad's funeral passed like a fever dream. I moved through the rituals of mourning like a sleepwalker, accepting condolences from neighbors who spoke about Allah's will, receiving casseroles from well-meaning women, listening to relatives recite verses about patience and submission. But inside, something fundamental had broken. I had expected grief, had prepared for the pain of losing a child. What I hadn't expected was the complete collapse of my ability to believe in anything I'd spent my life defending. Every time someone mentioned Allah's mercy, I heard Ahmad's voice saying, "Jesus." Every time the Imam spoke about the perfection of Islamic faith, I saw my son's face filling with joy as he looked at someone who wasn't supposed to exist the way Ahmad believed he existed. I stopped praying first. The morning after we buried Ahmad, I woke automatically at the time I'd been waking for 37 years, went through the motions of ablution, spread my prayer mat, turned toward Mecca, raised my hands to begin, and found myself unable to speak. The words that had flowed like water for decades stuck in my throat like stones. How could I praise Allah's mercy when He had taken my son just as the boy was finding peace? How could I recite verses about His perfect justice when Ahmad's last words had brought him more joy than a lifetime of Islamic prayer ever had? I knelt there for 20 minutes, waiting for familiar words to come, but all I could hear was silence. Not peaceful silence, but cold, empty silence of a conversation with someone who wasn't there. When Mahmoud found me still kneeling there an hour later, tears streaming down my face, he assumed I was overcome with grief. He knelt beside me and began reciting the verses I couldn't say, his voice strong and confident. I envied his faith, but I also felt growing anger toward his certainty, toward everyone's certainty, toward a community that seemed able to explain away my son's last words with platitudes about confusion and Satan's tricks. Teaching was next to go. Monday morning, a week after the funeral, I was supposed to return to my classroom, but when I thought about standing before 20 young girls, explaining the beauty of submission to Allah, teaching them to find peace in unquestioning faith, I felt physically sick. How could I teach them that Islam contained all truth when my son had found more peace in his last moments with Jesus than I had ever found in the Quran? I called in sick that day and the next. When the principal finally came to check on me, I told her I needed more time to grieve. She was understanding, but I knew I would never stand in that classroom again. I couldn't teach what I no longer believed. The anger came in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. I would be sitting quietly when suddenly I would be filled with rage so intense it frightened me. Rage at Allah for taking my son just when he was finding his way. Rage at Islam for teaching me to fear questions instead of encouraging them. Rage at myself for spending 37 years in what now felt like willful blindness. Rage at Ahmad for leaving me alone with these impossible thoughts. But underneath the anger was something worse, a growing suspicion that I had wasted my entire life following the wrong path. Every prayer I'd offered, every verse I'd memorized, every lesson I'd taught. What if all of it had been built on fear rather than love? What if everything I'd taught those young girls about finding peace in submission was exactly the opposite of what they needed to hear? Friends and family tried to help. They brought books about grief from an Islamic perspective, invited me to special prayer sessions, arranged for me to speak with other mothers who had found comfort in their faith. But their attempts only deepened my isolation. They spoke about Ahmad as if his last words were embarrassing mistakes to be overlooked, rather than signs of a heart that had finally found what it was looking for. My sister Fatima was the most persistent. "You're letting grief cloud your judgment," she would say. Ahmad was a good Muslim boy who got confused at the end. Satan attacks us when we're weakest. You can't let his final moments of confusion destroy your lifetime of faith. But I had seen Ahmad's face in those final moments. That wasn't confusion or deception. That was recognition. That was homecoming. That was my son finally finding what he'd been searching for in all those months of questioning. The silence of Allah in response to my crisis felt like the loudest sound I'd ever heard. For 37 years, I had believed that he heard every prayer, that my devotion mattered to him. But now, when I needed guidance more desperately than ever, there was nothing. No comfort, no clarity, no sense of his presence. Just the cold echo of my own voice in an empty room. 3 months after Ahmad's death, I finally admitted what I had been avoiding. I no longer believed that Islam contained all the truth I needed. I no longer trusted that Allah loved me unconditionally. I no longer felt that my prayers went anywhere beyond the ceiling. I had lost my faith, and with it, my identity, my community, my sense of purpose. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely alone with my thoughts, my doubts, and my grief. And in that terrible isolation, I began to wonder if the Jesus my son had seen might be real after all. The dreams started 6 weeks after I buried Ahmad, on a night when I had finally cried myself into exhaustion. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, my mind cycling through the same questions. Had I failed my son by teaching him to fear God instead of love him? Had his final words been a rejection of everything I'd tried to give him, or a gift showing me something I'd missed? The dream was nothing like the nightmares I'd been expecting. Instead of darkness and loss, I found myself standing in a garden unlike any place I'd ever seen. The colors were too vivid to be real. Flowers in shades that don't exist, grass so green it seemed to glow, trees heavy with fruit that looked like jewels. The air itself felt alive, warm and welcoming, and filled with profound peace. And there was Ahmad, not as I'd last seen him in that hospital bed, but as he'd been in his happiest moments. 23 years old and radiant with health, wearing simple white clothes that seemed to catch and reflect the strange light of this place. When he saw me, his face broke into the smile I remembered from his childhood. "Mama," he said, and his voice carried like music. "I've been hoping you'd come here. I've been waiting to tell you. I'm happy. Really, truly happy. More happy than I ever was before." He moved toward me, gliding rather than walking, as if the ground was eager to support him. I tried to speak, to ask all the questions burning in my heart, but he reached out and took my hands. His touch was warm and solid and completely real. "I know you're confused," he said gently. "I know you're angry and hurt and frightened. But Mama, I need you to understand. I wasn't lost when I died. I was found. For the first time in my life, I was completely, perfectly found." Behind him, at the edge of my vision, I became aware of another presence. Someone tall and graceful, wearing white brighter than Ahmad's white, radiating warmth and love and safety in ways that made me want to both run toward him and fall to my knees in awe. I couldn't see his face clearly. Every time I tried to focus, his features seemed to shift like sunlight on water. But his presence filled me with peace I'd never experienced, a sense of being completely known and completely accepted. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding, looking around my familiar bedroom with confusion. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that for a moment I couldn't understand where I was. I could still feel the warmth of Ahmad's hands, could still sense that overwhelming presence of love and peace. But now there was only darkness and silence and terrible emptiness. I told myself it was just grief playing tricks, just my desperate heart creating comfort I couldn't find in waking life. But the dream came again, the next night, and the next. Each time, the details were slightly different. Sometimes we walked through that impossible garden. Sometimes we sat beside a singing stream. Sometimes we simply stood in comfortable silence while that presence of perfect love surrounded us. But always, there was that figure in white just beyond clear vision. And always, Ahmad would speak about his happiness, about the peace he'd found, about the love that had been waiting for him. "He was calling me for so long, Mama," Ahmad told me in one particularly vivid dream. Through all those questions I couldn't stop asking, through all that restlessness during prayers, through all those moments when I felt like something was missing, he was there the whole time, waiting for me to turn toward him instead of toward my fear. I began to look forward to sleep, to those precious hours when I could see my son again and feel that overwhelming presence of unconditional love. But the dreams also brought confusion and fear. Islamic teaching was clear about how Satan could disguise himself as an angel of light, how grief could make a person vulnerable to spiritual deception. I consulted books about dream interpretation in Islam, looking for some framework to understand what was happening. But the books spoke only of dreams that confirmed existing faith, dreams that drew believers closer to Allah. They had no category for dreams that seemed to point toward Jesus, no explanation for visions that brought peace through a figure my faith had taught me was not God incarnate. The internal war was exhausting. Part of me treasured these dreams, clung to them as the only source of comfort in a gray and meaningless world. But another part was terrified that I was being led astray, that my grief had made me vulnerable to exactly the kind of spiritual deception I'd spent years warning my students about. One night, about 3 months after the dreams began, I decided to test them. If these visions were really from God, I reasoned, then surely He would give me some sign, some way to know whether I should trust what I was experiencing. Before falling asleep, I prayed. Not to Allah, because I still couldn't bear to address a God who felt distant and silent, but to whoever might be listening. If these dreams are real, if Ahmad is really with you, if you are really the Jesus he saw when he died, then show me something I can't explain away. That night's dream was different. Instead of the peaceful garden, I found myself at the edge of eternity. Not quite heaven, not quite earth, but somewhere between where normal reality seemed suspended. Ahmad was there, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a man whose presence filled the entire space with light and love and holiness. So intense I should have been terrified. But instead of fear, I felt an overwhelming desire to run to him, to finally come home. This time, I could see his face clearly. It was kind beyond description, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the character that shone through his eyes. When he looked at me, I felt seen and known, and loved more completely than I had ever felt in my entire life. "Daughter," he said, and the word wrapped around my heart like a warm embrace. "I know you're afraid. I know you've been taught to fear me, to see me as less than I am. But I am not your enemy. I am the fulfillment of every genuine prayer you've ever offered, every moment you've truly sought God's face, every time your heart has longed for unconditional love. Your son found me because I was calling him, and now I'm calling you." When I woke from that dream, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something stronger. A desperate need to know if what I'd experienced was real. For the first time since Ahmad's death, I felt like I had a direction to move in, even if I had no idea where that direction might lead me. It took me 2 more weeks to work up the courage to enter Ahmad's room after that final, vivid dream. His door had remained closed since the day we brought his belongings back from the university, and every time I passed it, I felt a mixture of longing and dread that kept me walking past without stopping. But the figure in white from my dreams had called me daughter, had claimed to be calling me just as he'd called Ahmad. And I knew I couldn't continue avoiding the questions keeping me awake at night. The room smelled like him still, cologne and textbooks, and the faint scent of prayer oil he'd used during his more devout years. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Textbooks stacked neatly on his desk, clothes folded in drawers, a half-finished letter to his cousin lying open beside his laptop. But my eyes were drawn immediately to his nightstand, where a book I'd never seen before lay beneath Islamic texts I'd given him over the years. The Bible. Black leather cover, worn edges, pages that looked like they'd been turned many times. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might mean if I did. In my faith, we'd been taught that the Bible was corrupted, changed by human hands over centuries, no longer the true Word of God. The Quran was the final revelation, the perfect word, the correction of all that had been lost or distorted. But my son had read this book. My son, who had died with such inexplicable peace, who had spoken Jesus' name with more joy than I'd ever heard him speak Allah's name, had found something in these pages that I'd spent 37 years teaching him he didn't need. The contrast between what I'd been taught about this book and what I'd witnessed in Ahmad's final moments was too stark to ignore. When I finally picked it up, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. It was heavier than I'd expected and warmer somehow, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. It fell open naturally to a page Ahmad had marked heavily with underlines and notes in his careful handwriting. At the top, in English I could barely read, were words that seemed to glow. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Rest. When was the last time I'd felt anything remotely like rest? I read the sentence again, slowly, struggling with English words but understanding the invitation clearly enough. This Jesus was speaking directly to people who were tired, people carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. People like me. In the margins, Ahmad had written in Urdu, "This is what I've been looking for my whole life." I turned the page and found more underlined passages, more notes in Ahmad's handwriting. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Beside this, Ahmad had written, "Love, not fear. Choice, the choice, not force. Life, not death." How did I miss this for so long? My heart was racing as I continued reading. This wasn't the Jesus I'd been taught about, a good man, a prophet, but ultimately just human. This was someone claiming to be God incarnate, offering eternal life as a free gift rather than something to be earned through perfect obedience. This was someone who spoke about love as the primary characteristic of divinity, rather than judgment and punishment and constant threat of hell. I closed the book quickly, as if it might burn me, but I didn't put it back. Instead, I carried it to my room and hid it under my mattress like a shameful secret. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about those underlined passages, about the joy in Ahmad's marginalia, about the invitation to rest that seemed to echo in my mind. That night, after Mahmoud had gone to sleep, I retrieved the Bible and continued reading by lamplight. I started at the beginning of the section Ahmad had marked most heavily, something called the Gospel of John, and found myself reading about a Jesus unlike anyone I'd encountered in Islamic teaching. This Jesus spoke with authority about eternal life, about unconditional love, about a relationship with God based on trust and intimacy rather than fear and distance. "I am the way, the truth, and the life," I read, struggling with English but understanding enough to feel my worldview shifting. "No man cometh unto the Father but by me." In Islam, I'd been taught that there were many paths to God, that sincere believers in any monotheistic faith could find salvation. But this Jesus was claiming to be the only path, the exclusive way to know God personally. It should have offended me, should have confirmed everything I'd been taught about Christian arrogance. Instead, it reminded me of Ahmad's face in those final moments, of the absolute certainty and joy with which he'd spoken Jesus' name. I read until my eyes burned with exhaustion, and when I finally fell asleep with the book still open beside me, I dreamed again of that garden where Ahmad waited with the figure in white. But this time, when I tried to approach them, Ahmad held up his hand and said gently, "Not yet, Mama. You're not ready yet, but you're getting closer. Keep reading, keep seeking. He's waiting for you to find him the same way I did." Over the following weeks, I developed a routine that felt both thrilling and terrifying. During the day, I went through motions of normal life, cooking, cleaning, receiving visitors, avoiding questions about when I might return to teaching. But at night, after Mahmoud slept, I would retrieve Ahmad's Bible and continue my secret exploration. I read about his birth, his teachings, his miracles, his death and resurrection. I read about his disciples, who seemed as confused and frightened and human as I felt. I read his own words about love and forgiveness and eternal life, and with each page, I felt something awakening in my chest that I'd never experienced in all my years of Islamic devotion. Not the fearful respect I'd been taught toward Allah, not the dutiful submission I'd practiced for decades, but something that felt almost like hunger. A desperate desire to know this person better, to understand what Ahmad had found in him. But with the hunger came guilt and fear. I was betraying everything I'd been taught, everything I'd spent my life teaching others. I was reading a book my faith considered corrupted, considering ideas that contradicted Islam's core beliefs. What if I was being deceived? What if this growing attraction to Jesus was exactly the kind of spiritual trap Satan used to lead believers away? Yet every time I tried to put the Bible away, every time I told myself I was being foolish and dangerous, I remembered Ahmad's face in that hospital room. I remembered the dreams where he radiated joy in the presence of that figure in white. I remembered the invitation I'd read in Jesus' own words, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I was certainly heavy laden. I was carrying grief, lost faith, exhausting questions no one wanted me to ask. And for the first time in months, something was offering me rest. Not temporary distraction, but genuine rest for my soul. The Bible remained hidden under my mattress, but its words were writing themselves across my heart in ways I couldn't ignore. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late September, exactly 6 months after Ahmad's death. I had been reading his Bible secretly for weeks, my understanding growing as the stories became familiar, but I had also been wrestling with increasing isolation. Mahmoud had grown distant and worried, clearly sensing that something fundamental had changed in me. My sister Fatima had stopped visiting as frequently, frustrated by my inability to return to normal. The principal of the madrasa had finally stopped calling about when I might return to teaching. That particular Thursday had been especially difficult. I had spent the afternoon cleaning out Ahmad's desk drawers, finally ready to donate his textbooks to other students. But at the bottom of one drawer, I found a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to me in his familiar handwriting. "Mama," the letter began, "I know you're worried about the questions I've been asking, and I know you think I'm moving away from faith. But I want you to understand that I'm not losing God. I'm finding Him for the first time. All my life, I've tried to love Allah the way you taught me, but I always felt like I was failing, like I could never be good enough to earn His approval. I lived in constant fear of His disappointment. But Jesus is different, Mama. He doesn't ask me to earn His love. He gives it freely. He doesn't demand perfect obedience before He'll accept me. He accepts me as I am, and then helps me become who I'm meant to be. When I pray to Him, I don't feel like I'm talking to a distant judge keeping track of my failures. I feel like I'm talking to someone who knows me completely and loves me anyway. Someone who wants to be close to me. Someone who calls me His friend instead of just His servant. I know this is hard for you to understand, and I know it goes against everything we've been taught. But Mama, what if we've been wrong about some things? What if God's love is bigger than we thought, more personal than we imagined, more free than we dared to hope? I'm not asking you to change your faith. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe there's more to God than fear and rules and earning your way to paradise. If something happens to me, if I'm not here to explain this in person, please don't think I was lost or deceived. I was found, Mama. For the first time in my life, I was completely found. By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. This letter was Ahmad's final gift to me, his attempt to bridge the gap between the faith I'd taught him and the truth he'd discovered. But it was also a challenge to everything I'd spent my life believing, everything I'd built my identity around. That evening, after Mahmoud had gone to sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding Ahmad's letter and his Bible, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. The silence in the house was oppressive, filled with unspoken grief and unasked questions, and the growing distance between my husband and me. I thought about the Jesus I'd been reading about, the one who promised to never leave or forsake those who came to him, who invited people to bring their burdens to him for rest. For 37 years, I had prayed 5 times a day to Allah, reciting the same words in Arabic, following the same rituals, maintaining the same posture of submission and fear. But I had never felt the kind of personal connection Ahmad described in his letter. I had never felt unconditionally loved, never felt like I was talking to someone who knew me intimately and cared about my individual struggles and joys. In that moment of complete desperation, I made a choice that would change everything. I slid off the bed and knelt on the floor, not facing Mecca as I'd been taught, not reciting prescribed prayers in Arabic, but simply speaking from my broken heart to the Jesus my son had seen in his final moments. "Jesus," I whispered, and the name felt both foreign and familiar, like a word I'd known in childhood but forgotten until this moment. I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if what I've been reading is true or if I'm being deceived by my grief and desperation. But my son believed in you. My son died calling your name, and he looked more peaceful in that moment than I've ever seen him. The tears came then, months of suppressed grief and confusion, and spiritual hunger pouring out in words I'd never spoken before. If you are who you claim to be, if you really love people the way my son believed you do, if you really offer rest to those who are tired and burdened, then I'm asking you to show me. I can't continue living in this emptiness. I can't keep pretending to have faith in something that feels dead and distant and cold. I need to know if there's more to God than what I've been taught. I need to know if you're real. I knelt there for what felt like hours, sometimes speaking, sometimes just crying, sometimes sitting in silence, waiting for something to happen. I didn't expect dramatic visions or supernatural signs. I had read enough of Ahmad's Bible to know that God often worked quietly, subtly, in ways that required faith to recognize. But what I experienced in those midnight hours was unlike anything I'd ever felt in all my years of Islamic prayer. The silence that surrounded me wasn't the cold, empty silence I'd grown used to when trying to pray to Allah. It was warm, expectant, alive with possibility. I felt held, not by physical arms, but by something vast and gentle and completely safe. The crushing weight of grief and confusion and spiritual emptiness that I'd been carrying for 6 months began to lift. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming bearable for the first time since Ahmad's death. And in that inexplicable peace, I heard no audible voice, saw no miraculous vision, experienced no dramatic supernatural intervention. But I felt, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic or evidence, that I was not alone. Someone was listening. Someone cared about my pain and confusion and desperate seeking. Someone was offering me the rest I'd been looking for in all the wrong places. When I finally climbed back into bed, sometime near dawn, I felt different. Not completely healed, not filled with perfect understanding, not free from all doubt and fear. But I felt like I'd taken the first step on a journey towards something real, something that might actually be able to satisfy the hunger in my soul that 37 years of Islamic devotion had never been able to fill. For the first time since Ahmad's death, I fell asleep without dreading the morning, and for the first time in months, I slept deeply and peacefully, surrounded by a sense of presence and care that felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey through foreign territory. The changes in me were impossible to hide for long. In the weeks following my first prayer to Jesus, I found myself unable to participate in the rhythms of Islamic life that had structured my existence for nearly 4 decades. When the call to prayer echoed from the local mosque, I felt no urge to respond. When Mahmoud laid out his prayer mat for evening devotions, I remained in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that were already clean, rather than joining him in worship that no longer felt authentic. My family noticed immediately. Fatima was the first to confront me directly, arriving at my house one afternoon with the determined expression of someone who intended to solve whatever problem was preventing me from returning to normal Islamic practice. She found me in Ahmad's room, where I'd been spending more time, reading his Bible openly now instead of hiding it under my mattress. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, as she stared at the book in my hands. When I didn't answer immediately, she moved closer and saw the English words, the cross embossed on the cover, the pages marked with my son's handwriting. Her face went white with shock and then red with anger. "Syra, tell me you're not reading that corrupted book. Tell me you haven't lost your mind along with your faith." I looked at my sister, this woman who had shared my childhood, my religious education, my certainty about Islam's truth, and realized that I could no longer pretend to be the person she expected me to be. "It was Ahmad's," I said quietly. "He found something in these pages that brought him peace. I'm trying to understand what that was." Ahmad was confused. Fatima's voice rose to a near shout. He was sick, influenced by Western ideas, deceived by Satan at the moment of his death. You cannot allow his final moments of weakness to destroy your lifetime of faith. This is exactly what the devil wants, to use your grief to lead you away from Islam. But I had moved beyond caring what the devil might want. I had moved beyond fearing spiritual deception more than I feared spiritual emptiness. What if he wasn't confused? I asked. What if he found something real, something I never gave him in all my years of teaching him to fear Allah rather than love him? What if these aren't the words of a corrupted book, but the words of the God who was calling my son home? The conversation that followed was the most painful I'd ever had with anyone in my family. Fatima accused me of blasphemy, of dishonoring Ahmad's memory, of bringing shame upon our entire extended family. She reminded me of my position in the community, my responsibility as a religious teacher, the scandal that would erupt if anyone discovered I was reading Christian scripture. When I refused, when I told her that I couldn't return to a faith that no longer felt true to me, she left my house with tears in her eyes and a promise that she would have to tell our parents what was happening to me. Within days, my mother arrived from Lahore, her face grave with worry and determination. "I have failed you as a mother," she said, sitting in my living room with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice heavy with grief. "Somehow, I didn't give you a strong enough foundation in faith to withstand this test. But it's not too late, Beta. You can still turn back from this dangerous path. You can still choose to honor your son's memory by living the faith I taught both of you instead of following his moment of confusion into apostasy." The word hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Apostasy. In the community where I'd lived my entire life, it was the worst possible accusation. Apostates lost everything: their families, their social standing, their place in the community, sometimes even their physical safety. But as I looked at my mother's tear-stained face, I realized that I had already lost the most important thing. I had lost my ability to believe in the religion that had shaped my entire existence. "I'm not choosing apostasy, Mama," I said gently. "I'm choosing truth. I'm choosing to follow my son toward whatever gave him such peace in his final moments. I'm choosing to seek a God who offers love instead of fear, relationship instead of mere submission, grace instead of the constant anxiety of trying to earn salvation through perfect obedience." Word spread through our community with the speed that bad news always travels in small, tight-knit religious societies. The Imam came to counsel me, bringing several respected elders who spoke about the importance of patience in grief, about the ways Satan uses tragedy to attack believers, about the horrible consequences of abandoning Islam for the false promises of Christianity. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors began to avoid me. The women I had taught over the years looked at me with expressions ranging from pity to horror to fear. But it was Mahmoud's reaction that broke my heart most completely. My husband, who had been patient with my grief, understanding about my inability to return to normal religious practice, could not accept what he saw as my betrayal of everything we had built our marriage upon. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said one evening, after I had declined to join him for Maghrib prayer for the 12th time. "The woman I married loved Allah, served him faithfully, found her purpose in following his commands. But you've become someone I don't recognize, someone who has turned her back on everything sacred, everything meaningful, everything that connected us as husband and wife." The ultimatum, when it finally came, was delivered not by Mahmoud alone, but by a delegation that included my parents, my siblings, the imam, and several community elders. They gathered in my living room on a cold October morning, their faces grave with the seriousness of what they had come to do. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Renounce my interest in Christianity, publicly reaffirm my commitment to Islam, destroy Ahmad's Bible, and return to regular mosque attendance and religious practice. If I agreed to these conditions, I would be welcomed back into the family and community with open arms, and we would never speak of this period of confusion again. If I refused, I would be formally disowned by my family, divorced by my husband, and expelled from the only community I had ever known. I would lose my home, my financial security, my social identity, and any hope of maintaining relationships with the people who had been the foundation of my entire life. I looked around the room at these faces I had known and loved for decades, and I realized that they were offering me a choice between truth and comfort, between authentic faith and social acceptance, between following my son toward the God who had given him such peace and remaining trapped in a religion that had never satisfied the deepest longings of my heart. I went to Ahmad's room and retrieved his Bible, holding it against my chest as I returned to face the people who had come to save me from what they saw as spiritual suicide. "I cannot go back," I said quietly. "I have seen too much, learned too much, experienced too much to pretend that Islam is still the truth I need. I am following my son toward Jesus, and I would rather lose everything in this world than lose the peace I've begun to find in him." The reactions were immediate and devastating. My mother wept openly. My father turned his face away. Fatima accused me of choosing a dead son over my living family. Mahmoud spoke the words of talaq 3 times, formally divorcing me according to Islamic law, and told me I had 3 days to gather my belongings and leave. But as I stood there, facing the complete collapse of my old life, I felt something I hadn't expected: freedom. For the first time in 37 years, I didn't have to pretend to believe things that didn't ring true in my heart. I didn't have to perform religious devotions that felt empty and cold. I didn't have to teach young girls to find peace in submission when I had discovered that real peace came from relationship, from love, from the kind of unconditional acceptance that Jesus offered. 3 days later, I packed a single suitcase with my most essential belongings, tucked Ahmad's Bible carefully among my clothes, and walked away from everything I had ever known. I had no idea where I was going, no plan for how I would survive, no guarantee that the Jesus I was following was real, or that the peace I'd begun to experience would sustain me. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was walking toward something true rather than away from it. I was finally free to seek God without the constraints of human religion, free to explore the kind of personal relationship with the divine that Ahmad had discovered in his final months. I found a small apartment in a town 3 hours away from everything I had ever known, a place where nobody knew my history or my family or the scandal I had left behind. It was tiny, barely more than a single room with a kitchenette and bathroom, furnished with the minimum necessary for basic survival. But it was mine, in a way that no place had ever been mine before. Not dependent on a husband's provision or family's acceptance or community's approval, but paid for with money I had saved over years of teaching. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone with God. No call to prayer from a nearby mosque marking the rhythm of my days. No family expectations about religious observance. No community watching to ensure I maintained proper Islamic practice. Just me, Ahmad's Bible, and the growing certainty that I was finally free to seek truth wherever it might lead me. The first few weeks were the hardest I had ever lived through. The silence was overwhelming after decades of structured religious community, and there were moments when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. I had no job, no friends, no family support, no religious framework to give meaning to my days. I spent long hours reading Ahmad's Bible, trying to understand the Jesus who had called my son home. But intellectual understanding felt insufficient to fill the emptiness that threatened to consume me. I began attending a small church I found a few blocks from my apartment, not because I was ready to commit to Christianity, but because I was desperately lonely and hoped that being around other people who claimed to know Jesus might help me understand what I was looking for. The first Sunday I walked through those doors, I felt like an imposter, an outsider who didn't belong in this foreign religious space with its unfamiliar hymns and prayers and rituals. But something unexpected happened during that first service. The pastor, a gentle man in his 60s with kind eyes and a soft voice, spoke about Jesus in ways I had never heard before. Not as a distant historical figure or good moral teacher or even revered prophet, but as a living person who was present in that room, who knew each individual's struggles and joys and fears, who offered relationship instead of mere religion. After the service, an elderly woman named Margaret approached me with a warm smile and asked if I was visiting or new to the area. When I tried to explain that I was exploring Christianity but came from a Muslim background, expecting shock or suspicion or immediate attempts to convert me, she simply nodded and said, "How wonderful that God is drawing you to Himself. Would you like to join us for coffee? I'd love to hear your story." That conversation over coffee became the first of many. Margaret didn't try to pressure me into making decisions or commitments I wasn't ready for. She didn't bombard me with theological arguments or attempts to prove Christianity was superior to Islam. Instead, she listened to my questions, my doubts, my confusion about what I was experiencing. She shared her own journey of faith, which had included seasons of doubt and spiritual dryness, and times when God had felt distant and silent. But it was during my private prayer times that the real transformation began to happen. In my small apartment, kneeling on the floor without a prayer mat, facing no particular direction, following no prescribed ritual, I began to talk to Jesus with the kind of honesty I had never brought to Islamic prayer. I told Him about my grief, about how losing Ahmad had shattered everything I believed, about my fear that I was making a terrible mistake by turning away from the faith of my entire life. The breakthrough came on a November night, 2 months after I had left my family. I was crying, as I often did in those days, holding Ahmad's Bible and reading Jesus' words. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Suddenly, these words stopped being mere text on a page. They became a living invitation, addressed personally to me, to my pain, to my exhaustion, to my desperate search for peace. "Jesus," I whispered into the darkness of my small apartment, "if you are really here, if you really see my pain and can give me the rest you promised, I'm ready to come to you. I'm ready to leave behind everything I knew before, if you'll show me who you really are." What happened next is impossible to describe with words that could convey the fullness of that experience. I saw no light, heard no voice, felt no physical touch. But in that little room, in the silence of night, I felt the presence of such love, such acceptance, such understanding that my heart could barely contain the intensity of it. I felt someone invisible embracing my soul, forgiving me for things I didn't even know I needed forgiveness for, accepting me not for my merits or correct beliefs, but simply because he loved me. For the first time in my life, I felt completely known and completely accepted simultaneously. There was no fear of punishment, no anxiety about whether I was good enough, no need to earn God's love through perfect performance of religious duties. There was only an indescribable sense of finally being home. After 37 years of trying to reach God through correct words and actions, I discovered that He had been waiting all along for me to simply come to Him as I was, as Ahmad had written in his letter, not as a servant to a master, but as a daughter to a loving father. In that moment, I understood that my son had not been lost in his final words. He had not been deceived or confused by illness. He had been the first of us to find the way home. His journey through doubts and questions had not taken him away from God. It had led him straight into the arms of the one who had been calling his name long before he learned to answer. The tears that streamed down my face that night were not tears of grief or loss, but tears of relief, recognition, incredible gratitude. I was no longer alone. I was no longer lost in a maze of religious rules and fears. I was a daughter of the King, loved unconditionally, accepted completely, called into a relationship that didn't depend on my ability to be perfect. From that moment, everything changed. Not the external circumstances. I still lived alone in a tiny apartment, still cut off from family, still uncertain what my future would hold. But inside, a revolution had occurred. The emptiness that had tormented me for months was filled with the presence of one who promised never to leave or forsake me. 3 years have passed since I walked away from everything I thought was my life to follow my son to Jesus. 3 years of studying the Bible, growing in faith, discovering depths of God's love I never imagined possible. 3 years of learning what it means to be unconditionally accepted, genuinely known, and eternally secure in the arms of someone who calls me his beloved daughter. The journey hasn't been easy. There have been nights when loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, days when I wondered if I would ever feel truly at home anywhere again. Moments when the weight of losing my entire family and community felt unbearable. But through it all, Jesus has been exactly who he promised to be. A friend who sticks closer than a brother, a shepherd who never loses even one of his sheep, a savior who specializes in making all things new. I found work as a translator, using the English I had learned through reading Ahmad's Bible to help other immigrants navigate their new lives in this country. The irony wasn't lost on me. The language skills I had developed while secretly reading Christian scripture were now providing for my daily needs. God's provision has been constant and creative, appearing in ways I never could have planned or predicted. But the greatest gift he gave me was community. The small church where I first heard about Jesus became my new family, welcoming me not as a convert to be celebrated or a project to be completed, but as a sister who belonged simply because she belonged to him. Margaret, the elderly woman who had first shown me kindness, became like a mother to me, patient with my questions, encouraging in my struggles, faithful in her prayers for my growth and healing. Through the church, I met other women who had lost children, women who understood the specific grief that comes with burying someone you brought into the world and loved with everything in you. We formed a small group that met weekly, sharing our stories, praying for each other, discovering together that God could use even our deepest pain for purposes we couldn't see at the time. I began to tell my story, carefully at first, then with growing confidence as I saw how God used it to touch other hearts. I spoke at women's gatherings, shared in small group settings, wrote letters to other Muslim women who were questioning their faith. Each time I testified to what Jesus had done in my life, I felt Ahmad's presence in a way that defied explanation, as if he were cheering me on from whatever glorious place he now called home. The dreams continued, but they changed in character. Instead of the desperate seeking and confusion of those early months, they became celebrations, reunions, glimpses of a reality where everything broken would be made whole. I would see Ahmad, radiant with joy, surrounded by others who had found their way to Jesus through paths as winding and difficult as mine. He would take my hands and say, "Mama, look what he's doing with our story. Look how he's using even our pain to draw others to himself." And it was true. Letters began arriving from women across the world who had heard my testimony online or through mutual friends. Women from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, women who were wrestling with the same questions Ahmad had asked, feeling the same hunger for unconditional love I had carried for decades. Some were mothers who had lost children and found themselves unable to pray to Allah with their old confidence. Others were simply seeking something more personal, more intimate than the distant deity they had been taught to fear.